Jack White, the Detroit-born musical force who first stormed into public consciousness as the raw and unrelenting half of the White Stripes, has always worn his influences openly, throwing names like Son House, Charlie Patton, Jimmy Page, and Captain Beefheart into the conversation whenever anyone asks him what shaped his sound. And yet what is striking when you dig beneath the surface is how much his philosophy echoes not just the ragged grit of old Delta bluesmen or the experimental daring of rock iconoclasts, but even the radical framework of a composer like Igor Stravinsky, the Russian-born master, whose 20th century compositions detonated concert halls with the same kind of shock and awe White once unleashed on garage rock revivalists. And although Jack White has never gone on record about his opinion of the Firebird Suite or the Rite of Spring, the parallels between his approach to music and Stravinsky's relentless belief in creative constraint are almost eerie, because both men understood at a visceral level that true artistic fire doesn't come from abundance, but from scarcity, from deliberately boxing yourself in, from forcing the imagination to fight its way out of tight corners, rather than drowning in the infinite freedom of endless options. And this is where the comparison becomes almost uncanny, because back in 2005, in a Rolling Stone interview, Jack White outright declared that the entire point of the White Stripes was the liberation of limiting yourself, explaining that reducing the band to just two members wasn't a gimmick, but a philosophy, a radical embrace of restriction, because a duo can only do so much without tapes, samples, or digital crutches. And in his words, too much opportunity kills creativity, a line that could have slipped right out of Stravinsky's 1935 autobiography, where the Russian master laid out almost the exact same creed, writing that his freedom was greatest when he moved within the narrow frame he had assigned himself, insisting that the more constraints one imposes, the more one frees the spirit. And what makes this comparison even sharper is that White has consistently doubled down on this ethos across his career, from telling Arte interview in 2012 that he deliberately plays guitars out of tune or keeps stage setups just out of reach in order to create obstacles, to describing how struggle is not just a byproduct, but the very engine of storytelling. And Stravinsky, almost a century earlier, was saying the same thing, declaring that obstacles are not walls but wings, that the act of narrowing one's field of action is precisely what liberates true expression. So imagine for a moment Jack White and Igor Stravinsky sitting in some smoke-stained Detroit bar, high-fiving each other in fierce recognition, realizing that despite being born on opposite sides of the planet and working in wildly different traditions, they had stumbled upon the same truth, that music is not about endless freedom, but about purposeful boundaries, that greatness is born not in luxury, but in the fire of limitation. And the comparison becomes even more compelling when you consider the personal temperaments of the two men, because Stravinsky was famously dismissive, calling Vivaldi greatly overrated, and tearing into Villa-Lobos with the brutal jab that whenever he heard music he didn't like, it always seemed to be by Villa-Lobos. And White has displayed that same sharp-tongued refusal to sugarcoat, openly taking swipes at contemporaries like the Black Keys or the Von Bondis, making it clear that confidence and confrontation are built into the DNA of creators who refuse to play it safe. And in both cases, that edge wasn't about petty rivalry, but about guarding the sanctity of artistic principle. Because whether you're composing radical ballets that make Parisian audiences riot at the aisles, or hammering out stripped-down blues riffs that slice through the bloated rock landscape of the early 2000s, the goal is the same: to remind the world that art is not meant to be easy, that music should not comfort but challenge, that struggle is not an obstacle to avoid, but the raw material from which real power is forged. And here's the beautiful irony. Stravinsky also believed that music was powerless to express anything concrete, insisting that its value lay not in communicating emotion, but in existing as pure form. And White, for all his belief in obstacles and constraints, has always been about channeling intensity, storytelling, and raw feeling. Yet even this difference only highlights the richness of the comparison, because it shows how two artists, working from different assumptions, can still converge on the same principle of creative discipline. And when you line up their careers, the resonance gets louder, because Stravinsky, born in St. Petersburg in 1882, became a lightning rod of rebellion against conservative conservatory culture, dragging classical music into modernity with daring compositions that shredded the rules of harmony and rhythm. And White, born almost a century later in Detroit, ripped through the bloated rock mainstream with a minimalist ethic that tore music back to its rawest bones. And both men in their own times were seen as rebels, disruptors, almost rock stars in their defiance, because Stravinsky was no genteel academic, but a provocateur who shook the world, and White, despite swimming in blues tradition, turned himself into a lightning rod of his era, refusing to compromise or polish himself for mainstream comfort. And when you step back, you realize that this isn't just a quirky thought experiment about connecting a garage rocker to a classical composer. It's a larger statement about what art actually requires, because whether you're strumming a battered red guitar or scoring a ballet that will make audiences storm out of the theater, the truth is the same. Limitation is liberation, rules are freedom, obstacles are fuel, and only by willingly confining yourself can you break through to something larger than yourself, something timeless. And that's why imagining Jack White and Igor Stravinsky in conversation doesn't feel absurd but inevitable, because artists who grasp the paradox of freedom through constraint are bound to recognize each other across genres, centuries, and continents, nodding in mutual respect, united in their rejection of ease. And you can almost hear them laughing at the idea that art could ever be born from unlimited resources or effortless comfort, because both knew in their bones that creativity is a fight, and the harder you make it, the sharper the result. And this is why their legacies, as different as they are, vibrate with the same voltage, showing us that true art is not about convenience but about conviction, not about excess but about essence, not about abundance but about the fire that comes from scarcity. And if you strip everything else away, that's the lesson Jack White and Igor Stravinsky leave us, that the greatest music, the kind that endures, is never about what you have, but about what you dare to go without.